Good morning, everyone, or I guess it's 12:03, so good afternoon. Welcome to the February Next Partner webinar brought to you by Atlas. My name is Lisa Friedlander. I am the Chief Revenue Officer here at Next, powered by Shulman Rogers. Next is an innovative model for the delivery of legal services to startup and emerging growth tech companies. We are 100% focused on startups, helping de-risk them and helping them grow and scale. Part of what we do is offer holistic value-added services like these partner webinars to ensure the greatest success for our clients and friends. So I am thrilled to welcome one of our partners, Atlas, today, who is kind enough to host this fabulous webinar. Love to introduce JoHannah Harrington, who is the Chief Legal Officer at Atlas. She leads the legal and compliance department, including commercial law, employment law, and legal strategy. She oversees the company's legal strategy aligned with Atlas's business goals and mission and provides regular counsel to Atlas executive team. Bill Daly is VP General Counsel of Employment Law, Operations, and Strategy. Bill leads a global team of legal, compliance, and business professionals, facilitating client growth and ensuring compliance across 6 continents and 165 plus countries. Bill brings more than 20 years of strategic legal and compliance experience. And the Chief Operating Officer at Atlas, Anthony Smith. Anthony's also here. He leads the internal HR strategy and operations, while also leading client operations across payroll, global mobility, and HR service delivery for more than 160 companies. We have an incredible panel here today with loads of expertise. Please feel free to chime in with questions as we go along. You can add them to the chat. We're also a small group, so feel free to unmute yourself. This is going to be a conversation with experts, so we rely on you to interject with your questions to make it the most valuable for all. So without further ado, JoHannah, I will kick it over to you.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to Next, powered by Shulman Rogers. We're really excited here at Atlas to be having this conversation today. I've got 2 fabulous experts. You know, Anthony and Bill really do bring a combined, I'm not going to say how many years, a number of years of experience. We'll just go number of years of experience in this space. And we're going to keep it open. We're going to talk through a lot of the compliance considerations we're seeing. We're going to talk through a lot of the interesting opportunities you have to globally expand, a little bit of background about Atlas for the non-Atlas folks on this call. Atlas is a global employer of record, which means we assist our clients to expand globally by hiring their staff in locations where they don't have entities already. For those of you on the call, like I said, not Atlas, it's really allowing us to serve each of our clients in those 165 countries around the world. We'll talk about what EOR means. We'll talk about the difference between PEO, because I'm sure you've heard of what that is and all that good stuff. But I'm going to kick it off. We're going to start really, really high level. And I'm going to have Anthony, we're going to start with you to answer this question. So what is an EOR and how does it help expand companies expand globally?
Yeah, very good. Well, first and foremost, super excited to be here with you all. And once again, thanks to Next for allowing us to have this event. We're excited to kind of share our thoughts, share our minds and our expertise with you all. And so, yeah, what is EOR? I'll be honest, the first time I heard it, I wasn't aware of it. And my first thought was, as soon as I heard what it was, it just makes sense, right? And that's the key thing. So EOR, the concept is an employer of record. And essentially what EOR business models do is help companies very quickly and efficiently expand into markets, as JoHannah just indicated earlier, where they do not have a legal entity. So in order to do business around the world, for you to employ talent or set up offices or whatever it may be, you need to have business registrations in those countries. Through an EOR model, it allows companies to very quickly and seamlessly expand into foreign markets, very timely, right? Can obviously get set up with team members and so forth in these markets very quickly, and avoid all of the hassle with having to open up banks, create that shareholder directorship and so forth. So very simply put, EOR is simply a solution to expand your business globally while not necessarily needing the infrastructure of local business entities.
Brilliant. So, Bill, what's the difference then between a PEO and an EOR?
Sorry, I was muted. So, as Anthony mentioned, kind of this employer of record idea is, we have these entities, we employ people on behalf of our clients. With a PEO, you're really more of a different kind of service provider. You know, you're facilitating, you're supporting, but you're not the actual employer of the individual worksite employees as you would be with the EOR. With the EOR, there's a real advantage to the EOR from a client's perspective, in that not only do you get the same services, or a lot of the same services you get with the PEO, but you also have that compliance and that legal liability and a lot more of the risk that's transferred over to the EOR provider. So I think that's in a nutshell. Anthony, you've got a lot more experience in the space than I do. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about some of the benefits and some of the ease with which the EOR model operates, and some of the the entity creation that you just mentioned, some of the headaches it alleviates, right? I mean, you don't have to start up a bank account. You don't have to worry about employee registration. You don't have to worry about time to market. You don't need to worry about these, the deposits or the proof of financial viability that you have in so many of the countries that are out there right now. And I think about even my own experience with EOR before I came to Atlas. I was advising a startup, and we had two really giant clients, two great opportunities, these amazing partners that were hooking us up with these great opportunities. But we were afraid we were going to have to say no to these opportunities because we didn't have the ability to support them in the countries in which they were operating. And the EOR model would have allowed us, had we had more familiarity with it at the time, allowed us to really go in and not have to worry about the setup of the entity, the cost, the time, the investment, the compliance concerns, all of those things that we're going to talk about today. So, I think just to put a finer point on what Anthony said about the EOR model itself.
Well, let's launch into that then. Besides all of that, why is it helpful? Why would anybody on this call want to work with an EOR? What makes it easier to think about that global expansion and all of that? And I'm going to let you two fight out who wants to answer first on that one.
Well, I think it goes to kind of what I was just saying, right? Where it's this speed to market, this ease of creation, the lack of infrastructure that you need to create, and the ability to really focus your efforts on the commercial aspects of your business, not having to worry about what do I do from an employment law perspective? How do I hire people in this particular geography? What are the considerations I need to think about with respect to paying them or registering them, or are there translation requirements? I can focus on actually taking care of the business at hand, which I think is at a high level one of the biggest advantages to the EOR model.
Yeah, I would say, for myself, so I joined Atlas the week before COVID shut down the world, right? So, of course, needless to say, it was quite an interesting time to join a high growth company, just not knowing how the market was going to react to EOR. So for me, let me give you maybe 3 or 4 very practical examples of how we've been able to support companies through their growth strategy with an EOR solution, right? Where Atlas came in. So number one, you had a tremendous amount of talent that were maybe in a country that says, look, if I'm going to have to work remote, I might as well, if I'm here in the US, go back up to Canada and be with my family in Canada. And if I don't have to be in an office, then let me, go do that arrangement. But many companies maybe did not have a legal entity in Canada and were at risk now of losing that talent because of work from home. And that's where Atlas was quickly able to come in and say, hey, no problem. We can employ that individual on your behalf in Canada. And now you can retain that talent. So that was number one. As we saw last year, especially in the PE-backed world, there was a lot of mergers and acquisitions taking place around the world once companies received their Series A funding or B funding, whatever it may be. And we've been able to support a tremendous amount of clients that say, hey, look, I really do want to acquire this company in France. And if you've ever done employment law in France, you understand it's not easy. So maybe they want a lot of the intellectual property that comes along with that acquisition, but they don't want to have to worry about managing the people side of that acquisition. And that's where they'll go to a company like Atlas that has all of that expertise and experience in operating in those countries. And then third, it's really about as we deconstruct the borders around the world and opening up talent pools. We've had so many clients come to us and say, hey, look, with my human capital strategy, I have X amount on people. How can we maximize the return on investment with the dollars with those people? And how do we look at various geographies that maybe we couldn't consider in the past, with accessing talent. So, you know, if you look, and I've been really preaching this a lot, if you look at locations like Colombia becoming the new tech capital of the world across LATAM, right? Amazing tech talent coming out of there. Now, how do companies, you know, are able to, or how companies that we support are able to now enter into those markets to maybe access those talent pools? So that's been fun for us. It's been super exciting for us, but I'd say those are probably the three biggest areas of opportunity in which we've seen the EOR market kind of really make an impact.
Yeah, and to that point, just thinking about that access to talent, I think one of the real advantages to a model like ours, and where we've been able to add a lot of value to clients, is helping them not only identify opportunities where they might have access to talent, but specifically make risk determinations, make commercial decisions on, you know, the actual geographies that they're exploring. So, you know, we've had so many clients come to us and say, well, I want to go to X country, but you know, you say, well, why that particular country? Well, I've heard the talent is fantastic, but then you kind of really start to explore and say, well, you know, the cost of doing business in that country is significantly higher than if you went over here with the same access to talent. So the ability to really kind of provide those custom solutions and really help people understand the global space, not just a particular geography that they maybe had their eye on. I always find that to be really, really interesting and really rewarding. And, you know, kind of to that point with the rewarding piece of it, one of the things I think we've noticed, and Anthony, you and I talked about this as recently as yesterday, one of the things that the EOR model brings to the table is that speed to market, but thinking about the results of that, or the impact of that ability to be quick, nimble, agile in moving employees around the globe. You think about, even in the last couple of days, what's happened in Turkey. So you have, you know, this geopolitical tragedy, essentially, that's happened in Turkey. Tons of displaced individuals, tons of people trying to figure out, what am I going to do, you know, from this point forward. You have companies there saying, well, how do we continue to service our business? We had employees in Turkey. Well, we've run into situations in other geographies where we've been able to move people from one geography to another on behalf of a client very, very quickly. And, you know, the ability to preserve jobs, to preserve, you know, kind of a strong economic climate, and to preserve our clients' business is, I find, really, really a rewarding part of our business.
Mm-hmm. And that's also helpful, I think. And frankly, gentlemen, we talk a lot about EOR and the support that we can provide for our clients, and hopefully folks on this call as well. But as we think about globally expanding in general, because that's obviously what we do on a day-to-day basis, we think about global expansion in general. What are some of those things outside of why EOR is great? Because obviously we could talk about that for the rest of the hour, and I would love to have that conversation, let's be honest. But what are some other things that we really need to think about when we're thinking about global expansion for those on this call, whether or not they're going to hire their first person in Colombia because it's a tech hub, or if they're thinking about visa mobility? What are some of those bigger picture items that we probably want to talk through a little bit for these guys as we think about globally expanding, maybe to Colombia or Turkey or wherever?
I'll start off by saying, look, every company will tell you their talent is their greatest asset, and that's without doubt true. But your talent can also be your biggest liability, right? It's particularly on how you manage them, right? From an employment law perspective. And I can tell you, I've seen some cases over my years where maybe organizations have been operating in a country and legally operating because they have a legal entity, but they don't have the right support mechanism behind it, whether it's HR guidance or the legal employment guidance, right? When it comes to terminations, or when it comes to handling maternity leave, paternity leave, whatever it may be. And it has ended up costing those companies dearly, right? From a revenue or profitability standpoint. So, you know, I think the biggest thing is, as you do expand globally, there's a lot of nuances to local legislation, whether it's labor agreements or whether it's collective bargaining agreements or whatever it may be, that you do have to adhere to. And if you don't have that expertise in place to help support you, it can be a very costly solution with the expansion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, so many of our clients, and I think most of the folks on this call have a very U.S. centric view of the world, right? And particularly on the employment law side, we're very different than the rest of the world. And you know, we're the kind of the unique spot in the world when it comes to how we employ people, right? And so that ability to educate clients and help clients manage through that is a critical piece, right? Because to Anthony's point, there's so much risk associated with non-compliance, and we think of risk in the terms of, well, how many dollars am I going to lose to penalties this year, or relative to this particular issue. But to Anthony, what he touched on with the kind of the commercial impact, but the reputational impact and the shareholder, lack of shareholder confidence and all of those things. But think of it just from an employee perspective. Most of the time when you're going into these foreign markets, you're employing people in those markets that have had other jobs. So they know how it's supposed to work. And if you don't, that's a recipe for disaster. You have higher attrition, you have higher ability to, or excuse me, lower ability to attract the talent that you're actually looking for. So, it tends to cascade if you are continuing to look at it through the lens of your US based experience. Mm-hmm. And when you start talking about hundreds of different countries, there's hundreds of different schemes, and the ability to understand all of the nuances in each one of those, it's very challenging, particularly for those companies that are just starting to dip their toe into the global market.
Mm-hmm. And I think as you dip your toe in and as you consider those big steps into the next direction for the company, and we think about that risk mitigation, how do we help, and how do we think about building partnerships in a global expanding economy? And how can we think through what the startups on this call might want to consider as they look at partnerships in a global economy, and look at partnerships across different organizations in different countries in that space too? That was a very leading question.
Yeah. When we look at partnerships, right, particularly whether it's true just human capital partnerships from a recruitment lens, or from a talent management lens, or from a technology lens, from a legal lens, one for me, the key thing is, particularly locally, is making sure that that individual is the expert in those local locations, right, and truly understands the local nuances of what's customary and so forth. And, I'll sidebar very quickly for a second. I was on a call yesterday, or doing a webinar yesterday with Coursera. And one of the questions that popped up was around tracking from a DEI perspective, sexual orientation and so forth in your company's talent strategy. And I had to smile, because I realized that if you were asking that question in certain geographies around the world, it would be illegal, right? And that's where you have to understand that when you do go out into foreign markets, you have to understand what is legally acceptable to ask and what is not legally acceptable to ask. So, sorry, I just went down a quick sidebar, but when looking at partnerships, again, it really comes into understanding, the local nuances of the location in which you're in. But again, everything comes back to business value, right? How much value is that partnership going to bring into your business, and how can you leverage that?
Yeah, and I think to that point, that local expertise, I can't overstate the importance of that. I look at our team, and as Lisa said in the introduction, we have people in about 14 or 15 countries now on my team alone, right? On 6 continents. And we understand the importance of that local view. We think about our payroll systems, right? I mean, that's a very complicated and very nuanced part of any business, and the importance of getting that right. It's core to what you do as an employer. It's core to what you do as a business. If you can't pay your people and you can't make sure you're compliant with all those local nuances, you're not even getting started. So I think, just to put a finer point on what Anthony said, that ability to be global, like global yet local, I think is incredibly important as you think about expansion and what partners you're considering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a nice
last thing I'll say,
quick question that I think is now a good time to maybe answer. Yeah, go ahead. Christina has a question in there.
Yeah,
are there any regulations regarding the EOR business model in any country that you guys are aware of?
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to the expertise on the team and things along those lines. So Anthony, you had one more thought, and then let's answer Christina's question, because that's a nice bleed in or connection point to what we were talking about.
Yeah, my last quick thought on the partnerships, right, is I think you also have to really understand what's your core value and what you bring, and then how do you bring in partnerships within an ecosystem that's going to support your core value. But what a lot of companies will often do, especially going international, is go very wide but not very deep, and that's what gets them in trouble. And I'll give a perfect example. Atlas has purposely chosen not to get into the recruitment space, right? So a lot of times we do have clients come to us and say, hey, we do want to hire somebody in Zimbabwe, right? But we actually need help in going out and procuring and finding that individual. Now, and this will tie back into Christina's questions as well, right? Atlas has chosen not to get into the talent acquisition space because we know that it's not currently the depth of our expertise. So we will work with local partners, right, in that space to then support our clients and so forth. But that actually comes into Christina's question, are there certain regulations? Yes, within EOR, you have to be very careful of the business license in which you hold within those countries to not be seen just as a staffing company, right? And that is a big part of the reason why Atlas has chosen not to get into the recruitment space, because if you hold a staffing license, that then impacts your ability to serve in other aspects, such as like an EOR model.
Yeah, and to put another point on that, or to bolster that point, I'd say that's one of the biggest obstacles right now is this evolving legislative landscape across the globe. I mean, I really look at it as kind of a constant conversation between companies like us in the EOR space and these legislatures. It's an evolving model, and there are a lot of countries out there that are still trying to figure out, well, what exactly are you? What exactly are you doing? Are you a staffing agency? Are you a leasing agency? What do you do? So part of what we do, and I think some of the agility that we're always focused on is helping not only to educate clients and educate partners, but helping to educate the legislatures and helping to educate the regulators. And it's like, here's what we do, and here's why we're not what you think we might be. And here's why we have this license. Here's why we don't have that license. And we've had great success with it to this point, but I think it's an evolving space. It's kind of a cutting edge, kind of innovative, operation. But it's with that, anytime you're innovating, you're always trying to continue to keep the conversation alive with the legislatures, so they don't do things that are contrary to your interest without knowing about it.
I think that actually we can extrapolate from there for those on this call too, because I'm sure you're all working in very innovative spaces and innovative mindsets as you're launching the next great thing here. And so if we think about regulatory considerations for whatever market each of our audience is participating in today, how can, going back to that partner question, finding the right partner to help guide through those regulatory considerations, learning about those regulatory considerations and all those compliances that arise across the globe. What are we seeing when it comes to other outside of employment? Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking about employment. We're an employer of record. It's our bailiwick. But what are the compliance considerations? What other partnership regulatory considerations should these guys think through at the highest of high levels? Because obviously, we're not going to go into the nitty gritties here. But what about things along those lines? How does that affect, global expansion for startups looking to go anywhere?
I think about the one that comes to mind for me right off the top is intellectual property protections, intellectual property considerations. We hear all kinds of things. We read all kinds of things in the news about piracy and ensuring that we're protecting our property here in the U.S. But globally, it's the same thing as we talked about with the employment space. Every country has its own nuances. Every country has its own protections and their own regulatory scheme. So understanding that scheme, I think, is really important, particularly for folks like on those on this call, where there's a reason you're investing so much time into your business. It's because you think you have something pretty amazing, and why not do everything you can to protect it?
Anthony?
I was just thinking a little bit further even about Christina's comments. So I'm going to go back to that just for 1 second, right? And this number may be off a little bit, but I think you'll get the general concept of what I'm going to say, right? So if Atlas, let's say in 2022, helped 20 different companies help expand into Nigeria, right? Think about it from a pure societal and economical standpoint, right? Most governments would very much welcome the EOR model, because what it's doing is it's opening up access for their local employees or local people to have access to multinational companies, right? That maybe would not have been granted to them if it wasn't for an EOR type of model. So what we are seeing is a lot of governments saying, well, how do we bring those opportunities into the Nigerias of the world, or the Ethiopias of the world, or the Malaysias and so forth, right? And finding themselves being more and more flexible to this EOR model. I mean, if you actually look at the nomad visa, right? The nomad visa is really saying, how do we get more employees into our country, and how do we loosen those restrictions, right? To allow, workers to come in and help boost local economy, boost local society. So I just wanted to quickly highlight that point as well.
Oh, great question, Lisa. Let's answer that one. That's probably one of my favorite questions. Are there any countries that prohibit the EOR model that we're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I would again kind of go back. It depends on how EOR is being defined and how it's understood. And I think, again, if you look at some of the things that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, EOR can mean different things to different people. True EOR, true direct EOR, like our model, versus say a PEO, where there's some confusion amongst the two. It really just informs the conversation. I'm not aware of any specific country that just says no. There are some things that maybe we need to, again, educate the regulators on, or say, look, you think we might be this, but let's just assuage any concerns that we're really not that. And I think about Mexico, for example. Mexico has recently passed a law that prohibits countries within Mexico from outsourcing certain jobs, certain duties to countries within Mexico, but countries that provide EOR services. But in our situation, that doesn't apply, because we will only operate in Mexico with countries that don't have an entity in Mexico, or in most instances. So while technically speaking, there may be some arguments that EOR is prohibited in Mexico, a true EOR does not fall within the coverage of that particular prohibition. So I think a lot of it is just making sure that we're having the same conversation where we're comparing apples to apples.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great answer.
I'd say too, we need to think about, and there's certain parameters in which we have to operate to make sure that we're compliantly doing this, right? So I'll give you another great example is if, let's say we have a client that sits in Belgium, right, that wants to employ individuals here in the US through our EOR model. Well, there's certain factors that we have to make sure that we adhere to, right, to be compliant as an EOR. So for instance, something as simple, and we're all familiar with a 401k, right? We can't say for this subset of employees, we're going to offer a more generous 401k match because that client wants to, and for all the other employees, it's going to be a lower match. No, we have to be uniform in how we employ these individuals. So I think for us to make sure that we look at, are there changes in regulations and so forth, of course, but we also have to make sure that we take a look at, are we adhering to the local rules and regulations from what an EOR is, and how do we make sure that we stay in compliance?
Absolutely. I can safely tell you, though, that in Cuba, only the government can operate an EOR, so private companies cannot. That is one location that I know of that it is not necessarily prohibited, but it's for a multitude of other reasons as well, it's very difficult to operate an EOR in Cuba.
Yeah, that's a great point, JoHannah. And that's why Atlas is in 160 countries and not in 190 plus countries, right? Because we realize there are certain locations where we choose not to, just due to complexity, local laws and regulations, or whatever it may be.
And that's that balance. That's that looking at the mitigating of the risk and the compliances that, Bill and Anthony have talked about already for us today. And I see a very helpful interesting question from Robert in our chat that I'd like to raise. It says, to mitigate risk, is a joint venture or an acquisition more logical and efficient, especially for small to mid-sized businesses? Of course, the partner culture needs to be seriously considered, as people seem to be the difference between a restful or restless night of sleep. Bill, I'm going to kick that to you to start.
Yeah, and I'm itching to get at that question.
I figured.
It's really a fantastic question, and that question and some of those considerations really kind of informed my first conversation with an EOR provider. I come from a background with big global companies, and that's exactly how we expanded into markets where maybe we weren't sure we wanted to make a full investment. We would find someone, we would find a partner, we would enter into some sort of joint venture with them. And then if we liked what was going on, we would ultimately acquire them. And it gave us the opportunity to dip our toe into a market, kind of take it, for a test drive and just see how it worked for us. There's a lot of difficulties when you talk about a joint venture that you don't see with the EOR model, for example, or I think about the cultural concerns that you just talked about. With a joint venture, you're working with another company which has its own culture, and not only the culture in the geography in which they operate, but their company culture. And does that match up with yours? So, that's always a consideration to take to think about. I think about the small and mid-sized businesses. Often you're not in a position to have the same level of commercial leverage entering into those markets with an established partner in that market. EOR mitigates both of those things. An EOR model allows you to maintain your own culture, right? Because you're the ones who are ultimately managing the day-to-day. You're the ones who are engaging and directly managing those individual employees. What a company like Atlas does is we simply facilitate the employment and provide that kind of infrastructure for you. You're still driving the bus as far as the day-to-day with those employees. You're able to kind of implement your own culture and make sure that the people that are working on your projects with you while employed by Atlas are still working side by side, hand in hand with your culture. So I think that's important. And then, just thinking about the ability to enter into that JV, right? I mean, there's always, it's a process to find the right partner, to ensure that that partner matches with you, to negotiate the commercial arrangements. With Atlas, if you've got the employees and you've got people on the ground ready to go, it's pretty well turnkey, right? We negotiate our contracts, we work through that, and then we just employ your people on your behalf, and off you go. Your commercial considerations are whatever you want them to be at that point, and you're not having to work through those partnership considerations that you often run into in the JV or acquisition space. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah,
I think that's great.
One comment on that too, I'll say is, and look, we've always heard the term, especially with talent and temp workers and so forth, try before you buy, right? And essentially that's what the EOR model can bring you as well, right? Before you buy, and we'll use the term buy, right? Going into a country, establishing a legal entity, opening up the bank accounts, right? Which, let's remember, a lot of companies, or a lot of countries, excuse me, still require you to physically be there to open up the bank accounts, right? Which requires getting on a plane. You got to have wedding signatures. COVID shut down a lot of travel, so companies couldn't do that. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of money to legally open up a business entity to then operate and do business. So, when we talk about a try before you buy, we've had a lot of clients come to us and say, hey, look, we're not entirely sure about this market in Germany, but we want to give it a shot. And we're willing to work with an EOR for the first 6 months or maybe 12 months. Let's see how it goes. Now, the good thing is if it works out, that's great, because then we can certainly work with you and do consultative services to help you open up your own legal entity and so forth. But equally importantly, if it does not work, well, as the client, you could very easily exit, right? You don't have to worry about shutting down a legal entity and everything else, because Atlas will continue to do business in Germany and continue to employ other client employees in that location. So it's a very quick in and it's a very quick out if you need to get out on behalf of our clients. So we typically see that ahead of the road of the JVs and everything else. But with that said, we still do a tremendous amount of work, and I'm smiling because I know just earlier this morning I was working with my team in the UK going through a 2P process, right? And I know our teams are quite well versed in that and do a lot of work there.
No, and that's really great, because it's that speed to market that I think we're really concerned with as we're growing and expanding a company. And JVs and acquisitions are awesome opportunities to inorganically grow a company, but sometimes you just need to get into that market and test it to see. And sometimes an EOR is a perfect partner to build that people strategy and help you with that. And as we help you expand globally and think through those next steps as an organization. I see another really great question in the chat, gentlemen. So this is from Kirk. And Kirk's asking, he says, very helpful information. He understands that the US and other nations anti-corruption laws make companies liable for actions of their overseas contractors and vice versa. Is that correct and a risk for the EOR and its client? And how do we mitigate that?
The answer is yes, that's a risk.
And that's it. That's all we're going to go. We're just going to say yes. Kirk,
question.
That's it. You just get a yes.
No, that's a great point. I mean, we all have a lot of experience in the compliance space, and you think about the UK Anti-Bribery Act and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act here in the US, and the wide kind of reaching influence of those particular statutory schemes. And there are others, of course, but those are two of the really big ones.
Mhm.
And you mentioned contractors. So your question, the answer is absolutely yes. You can be liable. It's all why you have kind of emphasizes the importance of a due diligence program, third-party risk program within your own organization. But thinking about how Atlas can assist in that, I think your question really puts a point of emphasis on the need for compliance and the challenges that companies face going into new markets and ensuring compliance. And one of the benefits that partners like Atlas or EOR can provide is, we provide that compliance in large part on your behalf. Now, if your contractor, or excuse me, if your employees are going out and doing things that are illegal or doing things kind of, are untoward, and you're managing them day to day, that's risk that's gonna always fall back on you, whether you're in an EOR, whether you're in a direct relationship or what have you. But EOR does mitigate much of those compliance related risks and gives that comfort. I think Robert mentioned the difference between sleepless nights and restful nights. If you've got this compliance scheme in place as a result of an EOR partnership, your people are going to be paid well. That their employment contracts are up to speed. That when they're exited, they're going to be paid properly and offboarded properly. There's some comfort that comes with that. And I think not only do you have the comfort, but you have the actual result. You're at a competitive advantage over your competitors who aren't spending as much time on things like compliance. I think about in my past, when we were trying to implement compliance programs, we would point to competitors who had just got rung up by the Department of Justice and, hey, look at our competitor, they just got dinged for $40 million. And customers would come to us and say, well, hey, what's up with that? How do you guys mitigate against that particular consideration? And, gave us that real competitive advantage, instills shareholder confidence, instills employee confidence. So I think that overall kind of eye towards compliance is incredibly important. So you also mentioned contractors. And in the EOR model, we don't really talk about contractors because we employ people on your behalf. So when we think about contractors, those are people that you have a contractual relationship with, but they aren't necessarily employed as your individual employee. In the EOR context, we talk in terms of worksite employees. So, we don't handle a lot of contractors on behalf of our clients. We employ individuals on their behalf. It's much easier to ensure compliance with an employee than it is with a contractor. So I hope that answers your question, at least at a high level.
I'll also comment, Bill, or actually, I think it was maybe yesterday, and JoHannah, we've worked on this in the past, right? So, part of that knowledge and expertise is also understanding country regulations and so forth, right? So we were just working internally on anti-harassment training in India, right? So in India, there is very specific anti-harassment training which you must deploy to your employees in order to be compliant. You can't just take an off-the-shelf harassment training and push it out, right? So it's these types of things where it's super beneficial, whether it's an EOR or whether it's working with that local partner to understand those compliance, but how do you mitigate those risks, right? Because now, hopefully nothing happens, but if something happens, we could always point, yes, we did deliver this very specific locally mandated training to our employees. Mm-hmm. And then there's a component of scalability scalability as well, right? Particularly from an economic standpoint. If you were going in and let's say you had your own legal entity and let's hypothetically say India, right? Or actually, let's use the US for an example, because we all know, I think we've all gotten very accustomed to what healthcare costs in the US look like, right? Having lived outside of the US for several years in Europe, I can tell you the US is just astronomically high with healthcare costs. So let's imagine you are a small business and you did open up a legal entity here in the US of maybe 5 people, 8 people, and you want to offer those individuals healthcare. Compared to working with an EOR that currently has maybe 300, 500,000, 2,000 individuals, your healthcare cost from an economies of scale is going to be very, very different, right? And that's what we were just supporting our client with in India with regards to this training, because we have a considerable amount of employees that are considered our employees in India. We were able to drive down the cost of those compliance trainings and everything else. So, not only just looking at compliance, but also looking at actually the cost of doing business in those countries is quite important.
And thank you for that. We're going to have one more question from the chat, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So if anybody else wants to raise a question, we welcome that. So Robert asks another question saying, are there any differences and or challenges? I'm adding an and there, Robert, because I think there's a combination of dealing with an international private or public company with respect to a JV or potential acquisition. Obviously, we know public companies have all those additional governance layers, all those additional concerns and considerations. So really, are there any differences or challenges in that? Bill, I'm going to kick that to you again.
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to the emphasis on compliance, right? As a publicly traded company, you're subject to much more robust reporting and regulatory considerations than you would be as a private company. But I think that emphasis on compliance is equally important for a private company, if for all those reasons we talked about, right? I mean, employee attrition, reputational risk, the distraction that comes with non-compliance when you're facing an inquiry from a regulator or what have you. Those are true for private and public companies. But you think about that kind of extra element of compliance for private companies. It gives you access to contracts with big public companies who have that layer of governance that perhaps you might not be able to put in place on your own. So thinking about an EOR, if you're partnering with an EOR on the compliance side, and you're doing an RFP or something response for a big publicly traded company, you can rely on and kind of leverage the compliance that you get through an EOR to then go back to that big publicly traded company with those extra layers of governance and say, look, as a result of our relationship with this third party Atlas or EOR, we have a level of compliance that we might not have otherwise had on our own, given our current scale. So, I think the ability to leverage that kind of mindset of compliance that we have pays dividends for both public and private companies.
Absolutely, Bill, and thank you for that. So I'm going to open up the floor. Not that we haven't already been taking questions, Lisa, but does anyone have any other questions they want to pose live on camera or not? They're happy to throw it in the chat. I mean, I can keep asking these guys questions all day about compliance and regulations, but let's open it up to everyone else. You're going to leave me in a room of silence? Nothing?
Don't be shy, everybody. Those have been some great questions so far.
Well, I'll prime the pump while you're thinking of some more. How's that? So if we think about shareholder confidence, thinking about the investors we have in our partner organizations, we've been talking a lot about compliance today. How can working with an EOR help to bolster the confidence of a shareholder in one of our startup partner organizations? And working with an EOR, how do we help bolster that confidence? How do we support that compliance across the organization?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to the employment law compliance. As I mentioned at the outset, we've got a team of professionals that do nothing but focus on compliance on the operational side, constantly ensuring that our employment contracts include everything they need to include in all of the geographies in which we operate, staying abreast of any sort of local developments within those individual countries, ensuring that we're educating our clients early on in the process about when you exit these employees, here's what the severance is going to look like. Here's what the notice is going to look like. Here's what's going to be required of you in offboarding. Because as we talked about before, the lens is very different for US-based companies. And making sure that we're compliant pays all those dividends that we've talked about. The lack of employee attrition, the investors saying, what, we're confident that our money is going to stay with you and not go out to the regulators in the form of penalties. We're confident that you're going to be able to focus on the commercial endeavors that we invested in your company to perform, rather than being distracted by having to respond to a government inquiry. And the list goes on and on and on. The reputational hit. I always joke, in my past life, we would do a lot of wage and hour class actions. And we would point to some of these companies that you all know. And I think of like UPS. UPS got dinged for like $400 million in a class action because they weren't paying their employees. Well, their slogan was, what can Brown do for you? And, the joke was always, well, we know what they can do for us, but we know what they're not doing for their employees. So, you think about those kinds of reputational risks. So the advantages of compliance go pretty broad and pretty deep. And when you don't have to worry about those, you can focus on the things that are more important to your business.
Anthony.
Yeah, not a whole lot more to add. I think that really well done, Bill. And look, for your shareholders and your board, right? What they want to know is how do we avoid big news? Exactly what Bill just said, right? How do we make sure that we, sometimes it's not always top priority at the board of thinking of people strategy, right? They want to really take a look at how are we returning ROI, or what are the numbers and so forth. So operating with an EOR, when you globally expand, you need to understand, how do we help drive business growth in these regions, right? And that's what they need to focus on. But whether it's making sure your compliance, I mean, think about it, right? And I'm going to come back to that example of France, right? Making sure that you have works council set up in France. Spain just passed last year, gender equality laws and reporting and interviews and focus groups that you have to set up and so forth. These are the things that we have to be aware of as we continue to help our company or clients grow into these markets. But more so making sure that we're compliant. GDPR, obviously, you've heard so much about GDPR. How are we making sure that we are handling your employee data in a very compliant manner, so there's no sort of hits back to you? So yeah, it's kind of that peace of mind. Board shareholders want to know that you can focus on doing business and growing business.
Yeah, and I think, just to hit GDPR, it's big scary. I mean, it's something that it's this evolving area of law. Data privacy is something that's on everyone's minds, and the amount of energy and the amount of time you can spend working through your own GDPR programs is mind-boggling, right? And again, it's wonderful to have someone to kind of take that off your plate. And I am now employing individuals in Italy, France, pick somewhere in Europe, and I'm not having to worry about that. And I'm able to access those commercial markets without having to worry about the GDPR considerations. And those are real. I mean, I always kind of keep like a running list here. Now, I know not we all look to the Goldmans and the Amazons and the Google and say, well, that's not us. But at scale, it's the same, right? I mean, Airbus got hit with a $2.9 billion violation for an FCPA consideration, or fine for an FCPA violation that we talked about before. Google got dinged for $102 million for a GDPR, a data privacy breach. That's just recently, and that's just in Ireland. Now, $102 billion is a lot of money. And we're saying, well, we're not Google. Well, can you handle $1 million fine? Is that as substantial to your business? Can you handle a $100,000 fine? But again, with the comfort that comes from partnering with someone that's taking care of that for you, you can focus on your business. And there's real comfort and real value in that.
And that holds true for other data protection laws. That holds true for other regulatory laws across the organization. We've talked a lot about employment cover. We've talked a lot about regulatory cover today, compliance cover, and all of that. I'm going to open it up again. Anybody have any questions they want to raise to our distinguished panel today?
Let's chime in there real quick for the panel and then those folks that will be listening to it on recording. Can you guys talk a little bit about sort of the stage, like we asked at the beginning, like the stage of the company? How big, how small do you need to be? Like, when do these types of arrangements and utilizing your services, when do they kick in? Like, how big or small do you have to be to utilize one of these models and Atlas?
Oh, great question, Lisa. Anthony, I'm going to let you take the first stab at that one.
Yeah, well, part of the exciting part of business is just the variation that you're able to work with, right? So, we've, and I'm hesitant to use specific name brands, so I'll be a bit generic for the moment, right? But we've seen super high growth tech companies coming out of, say, Germany or the Netherlands, right? That started with maybe only 30 employees that are testing different markets, and we've helped them expand into Poland and Spain and UK and the US. So that's like a true early adapter startup company that's just trying to get out and get to the tech talent they need. We've been able to support companies all the way through Series A that said, hey, look, we just closed this first round of funding. Part of that round of funding was the expectation that we would enter into foreign markets. We need a very quick plug and play, so we're supporting on that. And then we have the pleasure of supporting Fortune 100 companies that are maybe just testing new markets, right? And making sure that, it goes smoothly or compliantly, or, it's a quick out if they want to get out of that. So I think fortunately, and again, this comes back to that earlier point about you could be a Fortune 100 company and you can have that amazing talent that you just cannot lose. But that talent says, hey, look, I need to go back into Tajikistan with my family for the next 2 years and work there. I'd love to stay with that company, but I know you don't have an entity in Tajikistan. And that's where Atlas has been able to come in. So the beauty of it, Lisa, is, and that's the exciting part of our day, right? Everything from government, we do a lot of work with government, we do a lot of work with nonprofit, we do a lot of work with startup, and then we have the fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of Fortune 100s as well.
Mm-hmm. So small to large, Lisa, everywhere in between. All right, well, one more question I think here from Robert is, what overall future challenges do you anticipate? How do you manage geopolitical risks, especially as they are fairly rapid? So going back to that compliance consideration and those regulatory considerations that we've been talking about today. So how do we anticipate our future challenges? How do we handle the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to that constant conversation with the legislatures, right? Constantly staying abreast of what's coming down the pike. If one country's adapting a law, chances are there's another one that's thinking about the same thing. So, yeah, that's one of the benefits we have of our scope, where if we see something happening over here, we can anticipate it's going to probably happen over here and apply lessons learned from here over here. So, there's a real advantage to that scale, and that allows us to kind of pass that advantage and pass that along to our clients as well. The second part of that question, thinking about like geopolitical risk. I mean, it's a big, scary world out there, and things are happening rapidly. We think about what's happened in Ukraine. We think about what's happened in Russia. We think about, as I mentioned earlier, Turkey. And, that's one of the things that makes our job so much fun, is that ability to be agile and be in a position where we can address those issues in real time. And the reward that comes with it, as I mentioned before, when we started to see things happen in Ukraine, we had companies come to us and say, hey, you know what, our employees are displaced. What can we do? We care about our employees. We want to help them. We care about our business. We want to keep our business going. So what can you do for us? And in a very short period of time, we're able to put together a plan and move a great deal of those employees from Ukraine to Poland, or from Ukraine to, Kazakhstan, or pick a geography. And again, that's a real advantage to the scope that we operate in, or the breadth of geographies. So the ability to be agile and really help companies be nimble and be quick and quickly respond to those types of geopolitical considerations is yet another advantage of the model.
Yeah, even just to elaborate on that Ukraine example, right? I mean, what the EU came out and passed back in, I think it was around May timeframe, was, hey, look, we will waive the visa process. If you have a Ukraine individual looking to work in another EU location, we will waive that visa process so they can work legally in any EU. But the question, well, the response was, that's great, but we don't have a legal entity in anywhere, right, for those local Ukrainian companies. And that's where a lot of them were coming to Atlas saying, hey, look, now that the visa process has been waived, and we know that Atlas has those legal entities, as Bill just indicated, in Poland, in Kazakhstan, or wherever it may be, we were able to very quickly help support. And that's the deeper impact of what I think we do. And this is really the impact that I give out to my operations team. And I know Bill does it with his team as well, is look, we are not just onboarding, managing, and paying individuals. Right. In that example, we were able to support hundreds of families' lives with income continuing to flow in, despite that geopolitical situation that's taking part in that side of the world. So there's always opportunity, and that's where we were just grateful to have the opportunity to make a positive impact.
I think that's honestly a really good spot to wrap up today, Lisa.
Yeah,
I think we're happy to, of course, continue deepening these conversations. We've thrown our website onto the chat, so you can always reach out to us there through our chat function on the website. You can also shoot me an email and I can forward it on to the appropriate team member here at Atlas. to help you have further conversations or deeper conversations on the services that we do provide around the world. So we really want to say thank you to Anthony. We want to say thank you to Bill. It was an excellent conversation. As always, you guys knocked it out of the park. I sincerely appreciate it. And thank you, Lisa, and thank you to Next for having Atlas here today. We relish these opportunities to continue to expand, no pun intended, our world and expand our opportunity, our chance to work with new organizations too. So thank you, Lisa.
Well, it is our opportunity to thank all of you. I know I'm joined by everybody here today. This was incredibly informative and interesting. So appreciate Anthony, Bill, JoHannah, appreciate the partnership, appreciate the time that you took. Again, incredibly informative, and I know you'll have a lot of great follow-ups from folks. Again, the episode will be circulated, the recording will be circulated in case you came in late or missed something. We will circulate it to everybody and post it. We made it the whole time without a dog bark, and there you go. Well, on that note, have a great rest of your day, everybody, and thank you so much to the Atlas team. Really appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye now.
Bye-bye.